My wife handed me a forged medical report, called me biologically useless, and left me for a man she claimed could give her the family I never could. "You're a hollow shell of a man, Alaric," she said the day she walked out with our newborn son. I had no evidence to fight her, only the data she'd faked. 8 years later, that same son was diagnosed with a rare, aggressive lymphoma. The hospital called me as a last resort for a bone marrow transplant. I went, expecting to be a failure one last time. But when the lead oncologist saw the HLA typing, he stopped the procedure and called for the chief of genetics. They ran the sequence 3 times, their faces turning pale as they looked from the screen to me. And then, the doctor said something that didn't just save the boy, it decimated my wife's 8-year-old lie in a single sentence. "I am so incredibly grateful that you've joined me today. Your presence and your stories are what keep this channel moving forward." Before we dive into the heart of this mystery, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been blamed for a defect you didn't actually have? Have you ever had your self-worth stripped away by someone who was supposed to protect it? Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Whether it's a quiet office or your living room, let's connect. The phone call came at 11:14 p.m. on a rain-slicked Thursday in November. I remember the exact minute because I was hunched over a 150 scale model of the Stirling Bridge, meticulously checking the tension on the suspension cables. As a structural engineer, I live by the laws of physics and the reliability of data. If a bridge fails, it's because the math was wrong. For 8 years, I believed the math of my own body was wrong, that I was the structural flaw in my marriage. My phone buzzed against the drafting table, the screen illuminating the blueprints with a name I hadn't seen in nearly a decade. Mariselle. My heart didn't race, it went cold. I almost let it go to voicemail, thinking it was a mistake. But as the vibrations rattled my desk, a strange, methodical instinct told me to pick up. I didn't know then that the bridge I was building wasn't made of steel, it was the truth, and it was about to come crashing down on everyone. The drive to the hospital was a blur of rain-streaked asphalt and the steady, rhythmic clicking of my wipers, a sound that usually offered me the comfort of mechanical predictability. Tonight, it felt like a countdown. My mind, trained to identify structural weaknesses, kept circling back to the same fracture point, Maricelle's voice on the phone. It hadn't been the voice of the poised healthcare administrator I once knew. It had been the voice of a woman watching her architecture crumble. Walking into the oncology ward, the clinical scent of antiseptic and floor wax hit me with the force of a physical blow. I spotted her immediately. Mariselle was standing near a bank of vending machines, her silhouette as sharp and guarded as I remembered. She was still elegant, but the poise was a thin veneer over sheer exhaustion. When our eyes met, she didn't offer a greeting. There was no, "Hello, no, it's been a long time." "You came," she said, her voice brittle. "I'm here for the boy, Mariselle," I replied, keeping my own voice as steady as a load-bearing wall. "Where is he?" She led me down a corridor lined with muted television screens and the hushed whispers of grief. When we reached room 412, she paused, her hand trembling on the door handle. "He's been through a lot, Alaric. He's very observant. Just be careful." I stepped inside, and the world narrowed to a single point. Caspian was sitting up in the hospital bed, a sketchbook propped against his knees. He was pale, his skin almost translucent under the fluorescent lights, but it wasn't the illness that stopped my breath. It was his face. I was looking at a ghost. He had my high cheekbones, the same slight indentation in his chin, and eyes that held the exact shade of slate gray I saw in my own mirror every morning. Most striking was the way he held his pencil, the same precise, methodical grip I used when drafting blueprints. In that moment, the medical report Mariselle had handed me 8 years ago, the one that claimed I was a genetic dead end, felt like a phantom limb. I could feel the lie vibrating in the air between us. Caspian looked up, his gaze steady and unnervingly calm. "You're the engineer," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. I managed to say, my throat tightening. "Mom said you build bridges," he continued, his eyes searching mine with a curiosity that felt deeper than his 8 years. "Is that hard? Making sure things don't fall apart?" I looked at Mariselle. She was staring at the floor, unable to meet my gaze. The structural engineer in me knew exactly what I was looking at, a foundation built on sand. "It's the hardest thing in the world, Caspian," I whispered. "But sometimes, you have to find the truth before you can start building again." The heavy silence in room 412 was broken only by the rhythmic hum of the infusion pump, a sound that felt like the ticking of a clock I hadn't known was running. Maricelle's hand remained white-knuckled on the bed rail, her body positioned like a physical barrier between me and the boy who wore my face. "Caspian needs to rest, Alaric," she said, her voice regaining that sharp, administrative edge. It was the tone she used when she was managing a crisis, not as a mother, but as a coordinator. "The doctors need to prep the room. We should step out." In the hallway, the air was colder, stripped of the faint warmth of the child's presence. Standing there was a man I recognized only from grainy social media photos, Julian Mercer. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that screamed stability and success, the very things Mariselle claimed I could never provide. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and a burgeoning, sharp-eyed suspicion. "Julian, this is Alaric," Mariselle said, her words coming out in a rushed cadence. The donor we discussed." She didn't call me the father. She didn't even call me an ex-husband. To her, in this sterile environment, I was a biological contingency plan, a spare part retrieved from a warehouse. "I appreciate you showing up," Julian said, though his posture remained rigid. He stepped closer to Mariselle, his hand possessively finding the small of her back. "We've explored every other avenue. My own tests were inconclusive, and the National Registry is moving too slowly. We're grateful you're willing to help Caspian, despite the history." "The history?" I asked, my voice dropping an octave. I looked past him to Mariselle. "You mean the history where I was told I was a genetic dead end? The history where I was stripped of my rights based on a document you signed off on?" Maricelle's eyes flashed with a warning. "This isn't the time or the place for your theories, Alaric. We are here for Caspian. You are a last resort because the HLA markers in his type are rare. That's all this is. A medical necessity." She was attempting to gaslight the very man she was begging for life-saving marrow. I watched her closely, noticing the way she avoided looking at the door to Caspian's room. She was terrified, not just of the cancer, but of the truth that was currently sitting in a laboratory test tube. "A last resort," I repeated, the irony tasting like copper in my mouth. "It's funny how impossible things become necessary when the structure starts to fail, isn't it?" Julian looked between us, his brow furrowing. He was a man of logic, and the math of Maricelle's story was clearly starting to deviate from the results he saw standing in front of him. Before he could ask the question that was forming in his eyes, a nurse approached with a clipboard. "Mr. Boone? Dr. Mercer is ready for your initial blood draw and genetic sequencing." I nodded, stepping away from the wall. As I walked past Mariselle, I leaned in just enough for only her to hear. "I'm going to save him, Mariselle. And then, I'm going to find out exactly whose blood is actually on your hands." The atmosphere in the laboratory was thick with the hum of high-performance centrifuges and the sterile, blue light of computer monitors. I sat in a stiff plastic chair, my sleeve rolled up, watching as the phlebotomist drew vial after vial of dark, crimson truth. As a structural engineer, I understood that you couldn't build anything lasting on a fractured foundation. I had spent 8 years living in a condemned building of a life, believing my own biology was the defect. Dr. Julian Mercer stood behind a glass partition, his expression unreadable as he supervised the rapid genetic sequencing. He was a man who dealt in certainties, nucleotides and chemical bonds that didn't have the capacity to lie. I watched him consult with a technician, their voices muffled but their body language increasingly urgent. They looked at the screen, then at the physical samples, then back at me. It was the same look of disbelief I'd seen in the eyes of inspectors when a perfect bridge showed signs of catastrophic internal rot. After what felt like an eternity, the door hissed open. Dr. Mercer stepped out, holding a tablet. He didn't look like a man who had just found a donor. He looked like a man who had just witnessed a haunting. "Alaric," he began, his voice devoid of its earlier professional distance. We've run the HLA markers 3 times. The compatibility for the marrow transplant is a perfect 10 out of 10 match. That's rare, but it happens. He paused, his thumb hovering over the screen. But we also ran a standard paternal lineage scan as part of the cross-matching protocol. It's a formality to ensure there are no underlying genetic complications. He turned the tablet toward me. The graphs were sharp, undeniable peaks of data. According to the records Mariselle provided from 8 years ago, you were diagnosed with absolute azoospermia. A 0-count result. Biologically impossible for you to conceive. He looked me dead in the eye. This data says otherwise. Your DNA and Caspian's DNA share a 99.9% paternal match. Alaric, there is no medical world where that previous report was accurate. You aren't just a donor. You are his biological father. The room seemed to tilt. The 0-count report, the document that had been the wrecking ball Mariselle used to level our marriage, was a ghost. It wasn't a medical failure. It was a fabrication. I thought of the 8 years of birthdays, the first steps, and the scraped knees that had been stolen from me by a piece of forged paper. The math doesn't add up, does it, doctor? I asked, my voice a low, dangerous vibration. The math is perfect, Mercer replied softly. It's the history that's been engineered. I stood up, the phantom weight of 8 years of shame falling away, replaced by a cold, structural fury. The bridge was out, and Mariselle was still standing on the other side, pretending the road was safe. I sat in the hospital's dimly lit cafeteria, the blue light of my laptop reflecting off the surface of a cold, untouched coffee. Dr. Mercer had provided me with the digital access codes to my current files, but my mind was already several layers deeper, dissecting the architecture of the past. As a structural engineer, I knew that even the most complex collapses left a trail of breadcrumbs in the blueprints. Mariselle had been a high-level administrator at the very clinic where I'd had my fertility testing 8 years ago. At the time, I'd seen it as a convenience. Now, I saw it as the perfect crime scene. My fingers moved across the keys with the same methodical precision I used to calculate wind load tolerances. I wasn't just looking at the results, I was looking at the metadata, the digital fingerprints behind the PDF that had ended my marriage. It took 40 minutes of cross-referencing timestamps to find the fracture. There it was, a file modification entry from 4:12 p.m. on a Tuesday in 2018. The original laboratory upload had been 4.2 megabytes, but the final version, the one emailed to me, was only 3.8 megabytes. Someone had swapped the pages. I dug further into the clinic's legacy server, bypassing the surface-level reports to find the raw data from the automated counting machines. The 0-count report I'd lived with like a brand on my skin was a ghost. The machine's actual logs showed a completely different story, a robust, healthy count that made my supposed infertility a statistical impossibility. But the final proof, the smoking gun, was the user ID associated with the file swap. Boone admin. Mariselle hadn't just lied to me. She had used her professional credentials to hack into my medical history, delete my reality, and replace it with a fiction that served her exit strategy. She had turned my own body into an enemy so she could leave without the guilt of being the one who broke the family. A cold, structural fury settled into my bones. I thought of the 8 years I'd spent mourning a life I thought I couldn't have, while she raised my son in a house built entirely of stolen time. Every birthday, every holiday, every first I'd missed was a debt she had calculated and hidden in a digital vault. I closed the laptop. The data was no longer just numbers on a screen, it was ammunition. The foundation of Maricelle's life was about to meet the weight of the truth, and I was going to make sure the collapse was total. I looked up to see her walking toward me, her face still wearing that mask of weary concern, completely unaware that the blueprints for her deception were now in my hands. The sterilization of the prep room felt like a final, irreversible boundary. I lay on the gurney, watching the fluorescent lights flicker overhead, a rhythmic pulse that matched the heavy thrumming in my chest. As a structural engineer, I'd spent my life reinforcing others' designs, but today, I was providing the very marrow of a new foundation. The extraction was a dull, systemic ache, a physical manifestation of the 8 years of hollowed-out grief I was finally purging to save my son. Outside, in the high-tension vacuum of the surgical waiting room, the atmosphere was reaching a breaking point. Mariselle sat huddled in a corner chair, her eyes fixed on the operating-in-progress sign, her composure finally beginning to fray at the edges. Julian paced the length of the linoleum floor, his expensive leather shoes squeaking with every turn. I had left my laptop open on the small table between them, the screen darkened but the implications of the data I'd uncovered still vibrating in the air. Julian stopped mid-stride, his gaze falling on Mariselle. He was a man trained in the logistics of healthcare, and the inconsistencies in the story he'd been told were starting to surface like jagged rocks in a receding tide. Mariselle, Julian said, his voice low and dangerously calm. The doctor said the match was perfect. Not just compatible, paternal. He said the genetic markers are identical. Mariselle didn't look up. It's a miracle, Julian. That's all. Science has anomalies. Science has anomalies, but math is absolute, Julian countered, stepping into her space. He pointed toward the recovery ward where I would soon be taken. Alaric was diagnosed as infertile months before Caspian was conceived. You told me he was a genetic impossibility. But if he's a 10 out of 10 match, that means the conception happened while you were still living in his house. While you were still wearing his ring. The silence that followed was suffocating. Maricelle's breath hitched, a small, telltale fracture in her carefully engineered facade. She had built her new life on the premise that Alaric was the failure and Julian was the savior, but the biological reality flowing through the plastic tubing a few doors away was rewriting the history of their relationship in real time. Julian looked at her, and for the first time, the pity in his eyes was replaced by a cold, analytical clarity. He was realizing that the woman he loved hadn't just left a broken man. She had potentially manufactured the breakage to pave her way to him. As the night deepened and the surgery continued, the new husband stood in the shadow of the man he'd been told didn't matter, finally seeing the structural rot in the woman he thought he knew. The truth was no longer a theory, it was a heartbeat away. The morning light filtered through the hospital blinds in thin, horizontal slats, casting a ribbed pattern across the recovery room that reminded me of a bridge's skeletal frame. I sat in the chair beside Caspian's bed, my own body aching from the marrow extraction, but the physical pain was a distant hum compared to the hollow thrum in my chest. Caspian stirred, his eyelids fluttering before slowly opening. He didn't look for Mariselle or Julian. His gaze drifted across the room, past the monitors and the 4 stands, until it locked onto mine. There was no confusion in his expression, only a quiet, unnerving recognition. You stayed, he whispered, his voice thin but clear. I'm not going anywhere, Caspian, I said. I reached out, hesitating for a fraction of a second before resting my hand on his. His skin was warm, and as his small fingers instinctively curled around my thumb, a physical jolt went through me. A connection so visceral it felt like a circuit finally closing after 8 years of being broken. In that silence, a tidal wave of firsts crashed over me. I looked at his hands and realized I'd never taught him how to hold a hammer or a drafting pencil. I looked at the way he tilted his head and realized I'd missed his first word, his first step, and every single night he'd been afraid of the dark. I was an engineer who specialized in permanent structures, yet I had been a ghost in the foundation of my own son's life. Mariselle had stolen the mundane magic of fatherhood, the scraped knees, the bedtime stories, the quiet pride of a report card, and replaced it with a void. My chest feels different, Caspian said, looking down at where the bandages lay beneath his gown. Like there's something new inside. It's a part of me, I told him, my voice thick. It's going to make you strong again. He looked at me with those slate-gray eyes, my eyes, and gave a small, weary nod. I knew it was you. Even when I was asleep, I could hear your voice. It sounded like home. The word home felt like a structural collapse. I looked toward the door and saw Mariselle watching us through the small glass window. She looked small, diminished, as she witnessed the one thing she couldn't forge or delete, the instinctive bond between a father and his son. I had missed 8 years of his past, But as Caspian squeezed my hand, I made a silent, unbreakable vow. I would spend every second of the rest of my life making sure the bridge between us never buckled again. The impossible man was done being a stranger. The hospital's private consultation room felt like a pressurized chamber, the air thin and sterile. I stood by the window watching the rain-slicked city below, while Mariselle sat at the small circular table, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were translucent. The silence between us wasn't just the absence of speech, it was the weight of 8 years of engineered silence. I didn't start with an accusation. I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I placed my laptop on the table and turned the screen toward her. On it was the metadata I'd extracted, the digital footprint of Boone admin and the timestamp of the file swap that had redefined my life. As an engineer, I'm trained to look for the point of failure, I said, my voice low and steady. I spent nearly a decade believing the failure was in my DNA. I believed I was the broken component. But the math didn't lie, Mariselle. You did. She didn't gasp. She didn't cry out. She simply stared at the screen, her face draining of the last of its color until she looked as ghostly as Caspian had in his hospital bed. Alaric, I was scared, she whispered, the administrative mask finally cracking. We were drifting apart, and Julian offered a life that was certain. I didn't think you'd ever find out. Certainty built on a lie is just a collapse waiting to happen, I countered. I leaned in, my shadow falling over the evidence of her betrayal. I'm not here for a settlement. I'm not here to see you in a courtroom, though the hospital board might have other ideas about your credentials. I don't want revenge, Mariselle. Revenge is a waste of energy, and I have a son to raise. I closed the laptop with a sharp click that sounded like a gavel. What I want is the 8 years you stole. I want the legal right to every birthday I missed. I want the truth told to Caspian, and I want the forged narrative you fed Julian to end today. You told me I was biologically useless, but my blood is currently the only thing keeping our son alive. Mariselle looked up, her eyes finally filling with a desperate, panicked moisture. If I give you joint custody, if I tell the truth, Julian will leave. My life will be destroyed. Your life was destroyed the moment you decided that my right to be a father was a variable you could delete, I said. I stood up, feeling a strange, cold clarity. For the first time in 8 years, the structural integrity of my life was restored. You have 1 hour to tell Julian the truth. If you don't, I'll hand this data to the chief of staff and the family court transition officer myself. The bridge is gone, Mariselle. It's time to stop pretending you can walk across it. The hospital room, once a theater of crisis, had transformed into a sanctuary of quiet recovery. The harsh, erratic beeps of the monitors had smoothed into a steady, rhythmic pulse, the sound of a structure successfully reinforced. Dr. Mercer walked in, his lab coat catching the morning light, and for the first time, his professional detachment was replaced by a genuine smile. The counts are up, Alaric, he said, tapping the tablet. Caspian is officially in remission. His body hasn't just accepted the marrow, it's thriving on it. I looked at Caspian, who was propped up against a mountain of pillows, his face finally holding a hint of color that matched the sunset. He was sketching again, but this time, the lines were bolder, more confident. He looked up at me and smiled, a silent acknowledgement of the life force we now shared. The impossible match had become his reality. But as Caspian's health stabilized, the world Mariselle had engineered began its inevitable collapse. Outside the sterile safety of the recovery ward, the structural failure was total. True to my word, I hadn't sought a public spectacle, but the truth had a way of exerting its own pressure. Julian had left the hospital that final night after a low, devastating conversation with Mariselle in the parking lot. The discovery that his entire relationship had been predicated on a manufactured tragedy was a weight his own sense of logic couldn't support. The legal battle that followed wasn't the messy, protracted war Mariselle expected. When my lawyers presented the metadata, the digital footprints of her administrative overrides and the original, untampered fertility logs, the opposition's defense simply dissolved. You cannot argue with the physics of data. The court-appointed mediator sat in stunned silence as the narrative of the unfit, infertile father was systematically dismantled and replaced by the documented evidence of a decade-long fraud. Maricelle's professional world crumbled alongside her personal one. The healthcare board launched an internal audit into her access logs, and the poised, persuasive woman I'd once known was replaced by a hollow figure facing the loss of her license and her reputation. She had chosen certainty over love, only to find that a foundation of lies is the most uncertain thing of all. As I walked Caspian out of the hospital for the last time, his small hand tucked firmly into mine, the air felt different, clearer, sharper. The legal papers in my bag officially recognized me as his father, restoring the rights that had been deleted 8 years ago. I looked down at him, my son, and felt the immense, solid weight of the future. The bridge was finally built, and this time, the math was perfect. The afternoon sun slanted across the park in warm, golden ribbons, casting long shadows over the grass where families gathered for the first real weekend of spring. I sat on a low stone wall, the rough texture of the granite familiar under my palms, but my focus wasn't on the landscape. It was on the small, concentrated figure sitting cross-legged in front of me. Between us lay the intricate skeleton of a balsa wood bridge, a 1:100 scale model of a suspension design we had been working on for 3 weeks. Caspian held a small vial of wood glue, his tongue poking out slightly in the corner of his mouth as he applied a bead of adhesive to a delicate crossbrace. His movements were steady, his hands showing none of the frailty that had defined them in that sterile hospital room a year ago. The tension on the cable is the most important part, right? Caspian asked, his slate-gray eyes looking up at mine with a bright, inquisitive spark. Exactly, I replied, leaning in to help him guide the thread. If the tension isn't balanced, the whole structure pulls itself apart. You have to account for the weight it's designed to carry, even the weight you can't see yet. He nodded, satisfied, and carefully set the brace in place. Watching him, I felt a quiet, profound sense of equilibrium. My life no longer felt like a condemned building or a series of forged data points. The defective label that had haunted me for nearly a decade had been dismantled, piece by piece, and replaced with something far more resilient. I looked across the meadow and saw Julian walking his dog. We had reached a strange, respectful distance after the truth came out. He had moved on to a life built on honesty, just as I had. Mariselle was a distant memory of a storm that had passed, her influence over our lives neutralized by the sheer weight of the truth. She had tried to delete my existence, but biology and love had proven to be the only data that truly mattered. Dad, Caspian said, the words still hitting me with the force of a structural revelation every time he used it. Do you think this bridge could hold a real car if we made it big enough? I reached out and ruffled his hair, feeling the solid, healthy warmth of him. I think if we build the foundation correctly, it can hold just about anything. As we packed up our tools and prepared to head home, I realized that the bridge we had built wasn't just made of wood and glue. It was made of the 8 years we were reclaiming every single day. I wasn't just an engineer anymore, and I certainly wasn't a hollow shell. I was a father, standing on a foundation that would never buckle again. It's been a long journey from that rain-slicked night in November to this moment here in the park, and I wanted to take a second to talk to you, not as a character in a story, but as someone who had to learn the hard way that the most important structures we build aren't made of steel. They're made of truth. For 8 years, I let someone else's data define who I was. I accepted the label of defective because I trusted a document more than I trusted my own worth. But as a structural engineer, I should have known better. If the foundation is built on a lie, the entire building is just a ticking clock. The vital lesson I've gained, and what I want you to take away today, is that your value is not a variable that someone else gets to delete. People will try to forge a narrative about you to serve their own exit strategy. They might call you a failure, or useless, or tell you that you don't belong in the life you've built. But data can be faked. The truth in your blood and your heart cannot. If you're going through a season where someone is trying to rewrite your history, remember, the math always catches up. Hold on to the facts, protect your integrity, and eventually, the structural rot in their lies will cause their world to crumble, not yours. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to fight to reclaim your name or your family, I'd love for you to join our community. We're building something solid here, grounded in stories of resilience and the ultimate power of the truth. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button and turn on the notifications. We have so many more stories to share about people finding the strength to rebuild when everything falls apart. You aren't alone in your struggle, and together, we're going to make sure the impossible becomes your new reality. I'll see you in the next video. Keep building.